They call it pink gold. Potash is a vital ingredient for growing food and Canada production volume. It's now being touted as a secret weapon in this trade war with the United States.
It started, as so many of Donald Trump's trade wars do, not with strategy, but with spectacle. On July 15th, from a rally stage in Ohio, the former president thundered that Canada had become the 51st state that never pays its dues. His crowd cheered, flags waved, and cameras flashed. But this time, the outburst wasn't about steel or trucks or even autos. It was about something far less visible, a pale pink mineral buried deep beneath the plains of Saskatchewan. Potash. Trump's new tariff threat, a 35% duty on agricultural and energy imports if Canada didn't renegotiate unfair trade terms by August 1st, 2025, sent shockwaves through North America. At first glance, it seemed like political theater. Another America First headline. But behind the bluster lay something different. A genuine miscalculation about how power works in the 21st century economy. Because while Washington shouted about tariffs, Canada quietly held the cards. And one of them was potash, a resource that feeds the world. For those who don't follow fertilizer markets, potash may sound trivial. It isn't. It's the essential nutrient that allows crops, from wheat to soybeans, to grow strong and plentiful. And Canada isn't just another player in that game, it's the player. According to Natural Resources Canada, more than 30% of the world's potash reserves lie beneath Saskatchewan, and the country is the single largest exporter on Earth. When Russia and Belarus, two of the other top producers, fell under sanctions, Canadian potash became the world's most reliable source. That's not just a trade statistic, that's leverage. So when Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian agricultural goods, Ottawa didn't panic. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor now turned political leader, saw an opening. As Trump used tariffs as weapons, Carney began turning Canada's resources into tools of diplomacy, what one official called strategic calm. He knew that if the U.S. wanted to pressure Canada, it would also have to explain to its own farmers why fertilizer costs were about to explode. By late July, grain farmers across the Midwest were already nervous. A Nebraska corn grower told Reuters, "Our biggest expense this year isn't seed, it's fertilizer, and that's all coming from up north." The numbers back him up. Since the start of 2025, potash prices have surged 18%, and any trade disruption could push them even higher. For farmers operating on razor-thin margins, that's the difference between profit and loss. But this story isn't just about one mineral. It's about how Canada is using every pressure point: potash, liquefied natural gas, steel, and clean tech manufacturing to build what Carney calls economic sovereignty. When Trump talks about tariffs, Carney talks about leverage. When Trump frames Canada as dependent, Carney quietly constructs independence. Take LNG Canada. In June 2025, the project loaded its first cargo of liquefied natural gas from Kitimat, British Columbia, bound for South Korea. That shipment marked a turning point. For the first time, Canadian energy was reaching Asia directly, bypassing the U.S. Gulf and proving that Ottawa could diversify its trade routes. It was also symbolic. While Trump imposed tariffs and built walls, Canada was laying pipelines and launching tankers. Inside the country, the government doubled down. New investment incentives for fertilizer producers, funding for mine expansion in Saskatchewan, and proposals for a national east-west pipeline were framed as responses to U.S. uncertainty. Carney himself framed the challenge not as retaliation but as adaptation. "When the rules change," he said in an August interview, "you don't complain, you compete smarter." That line hit Washington like a quiet thunderclap. Because Carney's strategy wasn't just about countering tariffs. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement. By positioning Canada as both reliable supplier and independent actor, he turned Trump's threats into a catalyst for long-term diversification. What was meant to isolate Ottawa was instead isolating Washington. Meanwhile, the American side was showing cracks. Governors from the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, began voicing concern. Gretchen Whitmer, standing beside Ontario Premier Doug Ford at a cross-border summit, warned that the integrated economy that keeps the Great Lakes alive cannot survive another trade war. For decades, Michigan's auto plants and Ontario's parts suppliers functioned as one ecosystem. A 35% tariff could blow that system apart. And then came the human side. In late July, just as Trump's team was finalizing the tariff language, a small-town Saskatchewan miner named Caleb Jensen filmed a short video from his shift deep below the surface. "You want to talk about leverage?" he said, holding up a chunk of pink potash. "This stuff feeds your crops. You cut us off and your farmers starve." The clip went viral on Canadian social media, a working-class voice standing up to the rhetoric of Washington. It wasn't policy, it was pride. Across the border, farmers began echoing the sentiment. The Illinois Farm Bureau issued a statement warning that any disruption to North American fertilizer trade would increase production costs and undermine U.S. competitiveness. In simpler terms, Trump's tariffs might play well in rallies, but they would hit his own base hardest. Still, inside the White House, the message didn't change. Senior aides briefed reporters that the tariffs were designed to restore balance. But the balance sheet told another story. Potash imports from Canada make up over 85% of U.S. fertilizer supply, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. You can't replace that with rhetoric. And that's where the shift began. As Washington doubled down on symbolic measures, Canada moved on tangible ones. Within weeks, Ottawa accelerated talks with Indonesia, finalizing the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement on September 24, 2025. That deal eliminated tariffs on over 95% of exports, giving Canadian producers access to a fast-growing Southeast Asian market. It was a clear signal. If the U.S. wanted to close its door, Canada had other ones to open. In public, Carney kept his tone measured. He called for constructive engagement and praised the resilience of U.S. states committed to partnership. But privately, Canadian ministers understood what was happening. Trump's tariff timeline, the August 1st deadline, was less an economic threat and more a diplomatic gift. It forced Canada to accelerate diversification that had long been discussed but never fully realized. By the time the deadline arrived, the narrative had flipped. Trump was still talking about punishment. Carney was talking about strategy. In Washington, tariffs were a tool for applause lines. In Ottawa, they were an excuse to build the future. Because potash, that pink dust beneath Saskatchewan, wasn't just a commodity. It was a symbol of how leverage works in a world where resources, not rhetoric, shape power. As the tariffs came into full effect, the consequences began to unravel with chilling precision. Trucking companies in Michigan and Ohio reported cost spikes of up to 30%, not because of wages, but because of the soaring price of Canadian steel and imported truck parts. These were the same parts that, until weeks ago, crossed the border tariff-free under USMCA. Now, with Trump's executive order imposing a 25% truck tariff effective November 1st, the integrated supply chains that made the Great Lakes the heartbeat of North American manufacturing were suddenly in chaos. Fleet owners began canceling purchases. One logistics company in Detroit, which managed over 3,000 vehicles, revealed that its replacement cost jumped by nearly $40,000 per unit. For small business owners, that meant delaying expansion, laying off workers, or hiking prices. What was once a region of smooth industrial cooperation became a battlefield of survival. In Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, Canadian suppliers didn't sit idle. The city's parts manufacturers, already facing declining orders from the U.S., pivoted aggressively toward Europe and Asia. Canada's new Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with Indonesia, signed in late September 2025, gave those firms tariff-free access to a booming Southeast Asian market. Ottawa announced that over 95% of Canadian exports to Indonesia would face reduced or eliminated tariffs. Within weeks, orders began flowing from Jakarta and Singapore, markets once dominated by American machinery. It was a silent but powerful shift. Canada didn't retaliate with rhetoric, it retaliated with diversification. While Trump shouted about the 51st state, Canada quietly built bridges across the Pacific. Meanwhile, inside the US, the political aftershocks were impossible to contain. Governors from both sides of the Great Lakes, Democrats like Gretchen Whitmer and Republicans like Doug Ford's allies in border states, began voicing public concern. Whitmer called the tariffs a direct hit on Michigan families. She pointed to thousands of auto workers already furloughed as supply disruptions halted assembly lines in Dearborn and Flint. One of the most dramatic moments came when Whitmer and Ontario's Premier Doug Ford jointly hosted a Great Lakes Economic Alliance meeting in Windsor. The optics were stunning. American and Canadian officials standing together, united against Washington's trade policies. Ford, normally a conservative ally to Trump, didn't mince words. You can't tax friendship and expect it to last. That single line went viral across Canadian and American social media. The image of Ford and Whitmer shaking hands became symbolic. Not of rivalry, but of resilience. It told the world that regional cooperation was stronger than federal hostility. And this is where Trump's plan began to implode from within. In the White House, aides reportedly warned that the tariff strategy, designed to pressure Canada back into the American orbit, had instead triggered the opposite. Canadian investors were doubling down on domestic manufacturing, while US firms were quietly shifting operations north to avoid cost blowouts. And that's where the story ends. Not with a trade victory, but with a hard lesson in humility. Trump's tariffs didn't rebuild Detroit. They buried it under the weight of its own isolation. The Great Lakes governors stood up not for politics, but for survival. And Canada, once dismissed as America's 51st state, walked out of the cage stronger, freer, and more connected to the world than ever before. The truth is simple. Tariffs can close borders, but they can't close reality. The global economy has already moved on, and Canada just proved that quiet strategy beats loud power every single time. If you found this story revealing, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned, because the next chapter in this US-Canada showdown is only just beginning.